Imagine a crime boss so powerful, so deeply embedded in the fabric of a nation, that he was considered for assassination by his own government, a man who operated not from the shadowy back alleys of New York or Chicago but from a sprawling plantation in the humid heart of Louisiana, pulling the strings of a multi-billion-dollar empire with a quiet word and a steely gaze. A figure whose name was whispered in the halls of the CIA and the FBI with a mixture of fury and grudging respect, a kingpin, whose influence was believed by some of the most dedicated investigators to have reached its terrifying apex in the tragic assassination of a president, an event that shattered the American psyche forever. This is not a fictional thriller, this is the true story of Carlos Marcello, the little man, who cast the longest and darkest of shadows over the American South for nearly half a century. Before we delve into this dark and complex tale, a crucial disclaimer must be made. This narrative is pieced together from decades of declassified government documents, secret FBI files, congressional hearing transcripts, court testimonies, and historical accounts from journalists and biographers who dared to look into the abyss. Our sole purpose is to present a comprehensive, accurate, and meticulously researched picture of this formidable and enigmatic figure for your educational and historical understanding, aiming to separate the man from the myth while acknowledging the vast and terrifying legacy he left behind. The story you are about to hear is one of immense power, chilling corruption, systemic manipulation, and a shocking, often deliberately overlooked, chapter in the American experience, a saga that demonstrates how organized crime could fuse with the political machinery of a region to create something both immensely profitable and profoundly untouchable. Now, settle in, and let's begin to uncover the intricate, dangerous, and rise and fall life and legacy of the man they called the Little Man, a title that belied the colossal, almost mythical, stature he would eventually command, a journey that will take us from the dusty streets of a Tunisian village to the opulent, mafia-controlled casinos of Central America, from the smoky backrooms of New Orleans bars to the very doorstep of the White House itself, a story of ruthless ambition, cunning, survival, and an empire built on a foundation of fear, money, and an almost supernatural understanding of human weakness and political greed, a narrative that remains as relevant today as it was at the height of his power, a cautionary tale about the limits of justice and the enduring allure of absolute power in the land of the free. The foundation of this vast and intimidating empire was not laid in marble halls but in the gritty, impoverished, and fiercely tribal enclave of New Orleans known as Little Palermo, a world within a world where the language of Sicily dominated the air and the ancient codes of Omerta, the sacred vow of silence, were taught to children almost as soon as they could walk. It was into this crucible of immigrant struggle that the boy once known as Calogero Minacor was reborn as Carlos Marcello, his name anglicized by the relentless machinery of the American melting pot, a transformation that symbolized the shedding of an old-world identity for a new, more ruthless one he would forge himself. The French Quarter and the surrounding streets were his university, and the curriculum was survival. He learned to read the intentions in a man's eyes, the tension in his shoulders, long before he ever learned to read from a book, his formal education ending abruptly in the second grade, a fact he would later wear as a badge of honor, proof that his immense wealth and power were carved from the streets by sheer force of will and cunning, not handed to him by any system. His first forays into the economy of his neighborhood were small-time but telling. He ran errands for local bootleggers during the Prohibition era, his small stature and unthreatening demeanor allowing him to move through the city unnoticed, a tiny cog in the vast machine of illicit alcohol that funded the early growth of the American Mafia, and he quickly graduated from a messenger boy to an enforcer. His temper, once ignited, was legendary and disproportionate to his size, a ferocity that earned him the respect and, more importantly, the fear of those much larger and older than him. It was this capacity for sudden, brutal violence, combined with an innate strategic mind for organization, that caught the attention of the reigning powers in New Orleans, the Matranga and Provenzano families, who saw in the young Marcello a raw and valuable asset, a soldier who could not only follow orders but who understood the deeper game, the long-term play of corruption and influence that was the true business of organized crime. His rise through the ranks was meteoric, not by chance, but by design. His design. He cultivated relationships with local law enforcement, not with threats, but with cash, understanding that a paid-off policeman was a more reliable and discreet asset than a terrified one, and he began to build his own network within the network, a web of loyalists who owed their livelihoods not to the distant boss, but to Carlos Marcello personally, the man who put dollars in their pockets and food on their tables. By his mid-20s, he was no longer just a soldier, he was a power broker, the man to see for any illegal enterprise wanting to operate in his designated territories, from slot machines and jukeboxes to the burgeoning narcotics trade, though he would later publicly deny any involvement in drugs, a claim that would be thoroughly contradicted by volumes of FBI surveillance transcripts. His first major confrontation with the federal government came not from his criminal activities, but from his status. Born in Tunisia, Marcello was technically an alien, and in 1938, the U.S. government attempted to revoke his citizenship and deport him, a move that would become a defining obsession for him and a battle he would fight, and win, for decades. A testament to his resources and his profound understanding of the legal system's vulnerabilities. This early attempt to exile him only hardened his resolve and refined his methods. He realized that to be truly untouchable, he needed to own not just the cops on the beat, but the judges in the courtrooms, the politicians in the state house, and the sheriffs in the parishes, a lesson he would apply with devastating effectiveness for the rest of his criminal career, building a political machine that would become as formidable as his criminal one. The stage was now set, the player had emerged from the chaotic background of the New Orleans underworld, and he was ready to step into the spotlight, not as a supporting actor, but as the director and lead in a drama that would engulf the entire Gulf Coast and redefine the very nature of organized crime in America, moving it from the crude strong-arm tactics of the past to a sophisticated, corporatized model of corruption where the violence was always present but often hidden, a silent threat behind a veneer of legitimate business and political donation. The true coronation of Carlos Marcello as the unassailable monarch of the Gulf Coast's criminal underworld was not marked by a single bloody coup but by a quiet, strategic consolidation of power that leveraged a national crisis to his immense local advantage, a masterstroke of opportunism that demonstrated his superior foresight. The event was World War II, and while the nation's attention and industrial might were focused across the oceans, Marcello saw the conflict on the home front as the perfect camouflage for his most ambitious power grab yet, a move that would permanently eclipse his former mentors and rivals. The U.S. government, in its wartime wisdom, had decided to shut down the infamous Storyville district, the legalized red light area of New Orleans, a decision that, rather than eliminating vice, simply scattered it to the winds, creating a chaotic and highly competitive free-for-all among the city's criminal factions. It was into this power vacuum that Marcello stepped with the cold precision of a military general, understanding that the old, disorganized model of street-level pimps and independent bookies was inefficient and vulnerable. He envisioned a syndicate, a corporatized entity that would bring order, centralize control, and most importantly, maximize profits from every conceivable form of illicit activity. With the FBI and local law enforcement distracted by wartime duties and concerns over espionage, Marcello executed his plan, methodically and ruthlessly bringing every racket, prostitution, gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics, under his direct oversight, not by conquering them with a public wave of violence, though the threat was always implicit, but by offering a simple, brutal choice. Pay a tax to his organization for the right to operate and receive his protection in return, or face utter annihilation. Those who resisted, who believed their own power or alliances could shield them, found their businesses burned, their associates missing, and their families terrorized. It was a campaign of intimidation so effective and so silent that it barely registered in the mainstream newspapers, yet it fundamentally reshaped the criminal landscape of the entire region in a matter of months. By the time the war ended and the soldiers returned home, they found a new, invisible government operating in plain sight, one that answered not to the mayor or the governor, but to a short, stocky man with a penchant for expensive suits and a disdain for the spotlight, a man who now controlled the flow of every illegal dollar from the Texas border to the Florida panhandle. His headquarters was no longer a back-alley social club but the elegant and respectable town and country restaurant, where he held court daily in a large booth, receiving a constant stream of politicians, police captains, judges, and business leaders who came to pay their respects, seek his favor, or simply ensure they were not on his bad side. A daily procession of supplicants that was a far clearer indicator of his power than any headline could ever be. It was during this period that he perfected the art of the ice grip, a strategy of embedding his associates and bought-off officials into every level of the legitimate world, from the unions that controlled the ports to the licensing boards that regulated businesses, creating a system where his influence was like the humidity in the Louisiana air, invisible, pervasive, and inescapable. He understood that real power was not about being feared by the public, but about being indispensable to the powerful. He could deliver votes in key precincts, he could ensure labor peace for crucial industries, and he could make legal problems disappear for the right price, services that made him a valued, if unacknowledged, partner to the very pillars of the community who publicly decried the scourge of organized crime. This seamless merging of the criminal and the legitimate was his true genius, creating an armor of respectability that was far more effective than any bodyguard, an armor that would be tested almost immediately in the post-war years as a new, more dogged and technologically equipped enemy turned its gaze upon him, the Federal Bureau of Investigation under the relentless and morally rigid leadership of J. Edgar Hoover. The battle between the immovable object of Marcello's entrenched empire and the irresistible force of the federal government was about to begin, a conflict that would span decades, fought not with bullets in the street but with wiretaps, indictments, secret recordings, and a war of attrition in the courtrooms. A high-stakes game where Marcello would prove himself to be one of the most elusive and resilient foes the FBI had ever faced. The opening salvo in this epic, decades-long confrontation between the sovereign state of Carlos Marcello and the United States government was fired not with a gun, but with a piece of paper, a deportation order, a seemingly mundane bureaucratic instrument that the authorities believed would be their masterstroke, a neat and legal solution to the complex problem he presented. The year was 1953, and the federal government, armed with the fact of his foreign birth in Tunisia, moved to revoke his fraudulently obtained citizenship and ship him back to a land he had not seen since he was an infant, a strategy they were confident would dismantle his empire by severing its head from its body. A belief that profoundly underestimated the depth of Marcello's resources and the sheer breadth of his influence. What followed was not a swift legal proceeding but a sprawling, labyrinthine legal war, a showcase of Marcello's core philosophy that every man has his price and every system has its flaw. His team of high-priced, brilliantly cunning lawyers, funded by an endless river of cash from his criminal enterprises, attacked the deportation order from every conceivable angle, filing motion after motion, appeal upon appeal, dragging the process through the judicial system for years, a masterclass in legal obstruction that drained the government's resources and tried its patience. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Marcello's more traditional methods were also in full play. Key witnesses against him suffered sudden and profound memory loss on the stand, documents crucial to the government's case would mysteriously vanish from court files, and jurors found themselves the recipients of unspoken but perfectly understood offers they dared not refuse. A chilling atmosphere of intimidation that ensured the legal process was never quite as blind or as impartial as it was intended to be. The climax of this first great battle was as audacious as it was symbolic. After exhausting every appeal, federal marshals finally physically placed Carlos Marcello on a plane bound for Guatemala in 1961, a temporary victory for the government that was immediately and spectacularly undone by the crime boss's sheer force of will. Stranded in a foreign country with no passport and no official status, Marcello did not capitulate. Instead, he orchestrated his own resurrection, using his vast wealth to bribe Central American officials, secure fraudulent documents, and, in a move that would become the stuff of legend within law enforcement circles, secretly arranged for a small private plane to smuggle him back into the United States, a daring and illegal re-entry that saw him wade ashore somewhere along the Louisiana coastline and calmly return to his business as if his government-mandated exile had been nothing more than a brief, inconvenient vacation. His return was a slap in the face to the FBI and the Justice Department, a humiliating demonstration that their authority had limits that his power did not, and it cemented his reputation not just as a criminal, but as a folk hero of sorts within the underworld, a man who had stared down the full might of the United States and won. This event, however, also fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict. It moved the government from a mindset of legal prosecution to one of outright obsession, convincing key figures, most notably Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, that Marcello was not just a gangster but a personal enemy of the state who needed to be destroyed by any means necessary. setting the stage for a far more personal and vicious war. Kennedy, as the new Attorney General, made Marcello his #1 target, unleashing the full arsenal of the federal government upon him. The IRS audited his every business and associate, the FBI maintained constant physical and electronic surveillance, and teams of prosecutors were tasked with finding any charge, no matter how small, that could put him behind bars. This relentless pressure did not make Marcello retreat, it made him more dangerous, more insulated, and according to the most chilling and persistent theory of modern American history, it may have pushed him to contemplate the ultimate retaliation, an act of such monumental violence that it would forever sear his name into the national consciousness not as a crime boss, but as a potential architect of regicide, a shadow that would hang over the final decades of his life and career, transforming him from a regional kingpin into a figure of eternal, dark infamy. The relentless, personal crusade led by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy did not merely irritate Carlos Marcello, it fundamentally threatened the very ecosystem of corruption and plausible deniability he had spent 3 decades meticulously constructing, creating a pressure cooker environment where the cool, calculating businessman began to be supplanted by a cornered and infinitely more dangerous animal. Robert Kennedy was not just another politician to be bought or intimidated, he was a true believer, a zealot with the boundless resources of the federal government at his fingertips and a personal, almost moral, revulsion towards the organized crime figures he referred to as termites, and he saw the little man from New Orleans as a prime specimen to be crushed underfoot. The Attorney General's Get Marcello squad employed tactics that went beyond traditional law enforcement, becoming a form of legal harassment designed to break the man financially and spiritually. IRS agents descended upon his businesses, from his vending machine companies to his sprawling plantations, auditing every transaction, questioning every employee, and creating a constant, oppressive atmosphere of scrutiny that was intended to choke his revenue streams and signal to his associates that the protection of Carlos Marcello was no longer a guarantee of safety. This was accompanied by an unprecedented level of electronic surveillance, with FBI agents bugging his offices, his cars, and his favorite meeting places, their listening posts capturing thousands of hours of conversations in the hope of finding a single, fatal admission that could send him to prison for life, a constant, invisible invasion that forced Marcello into a nomadic existence, holding crucial meetings in the open air of his Churchill Farms plantation, whispering directives to his lieutenants while swatting at mosquitoes. The king of the Gulf Coast reduced to conducting his empire's affairs in the swamps to evade the ears of the state. It was during this period of intense pressure, according to the sworn testimony of several informants and the meticulous research of congressional committees years later, that Marcello's private utterances took a dark and specific turn, moving from general frustration to explicit, venomous threats against the man he saw as the source of all his troubles, Robert Kennedy, and by extension, his brother, the President of the United States. In one of the most chilling and historically significant recordings, captured by an FBI hide-a-mic, Marcello was overheard recounting an old Sicilian folk tale to an associate, a parable about a fearless and powerful dog that was biting a man relentlessly. The man, unable to get at the dog itself, finally realizes that to stop the bites, he must instead kill the head of the dog, the master who commands it. The metaphor was stark, brutal, and unmistakable. Robert Kennedy was the dog, and President John F. Kennedy was its master. This was not the idle grumbling of a frustrated man, it was a philosophical justification for regicide, a blueprint for solving a problem by eliminating its ultimate source, a concept that, once spoken aloud, moved from the realm of unthinkable fantasy into the dark realm of possibility. Whether this was merely a cathartic venting of rage or a genuine, deliberate order remains one of the most contentious and haunting questions in American history, but what is undeniable is that the atmosphere of existential threat created by the Kennedy Justice Department provided a motive of staggering proportions, a motive that few other individuals in the nation possessed. This motive, combined with Marcello's proven capacity for ruthless violence, his vast network of operatives who owed him absolute loyalty, and his deep-seated connections to the violent, anti-Castro Cuban exiles who were also enraged by the Kennedy administration's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion, creates a nexus of opportunity and intent that has fascinated investigators and historians for decades. The events of November 22, 1963, in Dallas, therefore, did not occur in a vacuum for Carlos Marcello. They were the culmination of years of being squeezed, hunted, and humiliated by a power he could not control, corrupt, or intimidate, a pressure that may have finally compelled the ultimate gamble, an act of such monumental audacity that it would, in theory, remove his primary tormentor and fundamentally alter the course of the nation's history. The assassination of President Kennedy instantly transformed the national landscape. Robert Kennedy's influence and power evaporated overnight. The "Get Marcello" campaign lost its ferocious momentum, and the Justice Department's focus shifted elsewhere, granting the New Orleans crime boss the respite and breathing room he so desperately needed, an outcome that served his interests so perfectly that it seems, in the cold calculus of power and survival, almost too convenient to be mere coincidence. The immediate and profound shift in the political atmosphere following the assassination of President Kennedy was something Carlos Marcello could feel in his bones, a tangible lessening of the pressure that had been crushing him for years, as if a great weight had been lifted from the humid Louisiana air, allowing him to breathe freely once again and reclaim the dominion over his empire that had been so severely challenged. The relentless legal assaults orchestrated by Robert Kennedy, which had once seemed like an inescapable tide, now receded into a manageable trickle, their driving force now a grieving, broken man stripped of his official power and consumed by personal tragedy, a turn of events that must have seemed to Marcello not just as a fortunate break, but as a divine or demonic validation of his most ruthless calculations. With the "Get Marcello" task force effectively disbanded and the national focus shifted entirely to mourning, conspiracy theories, and the transition of power to Lyndon B. Johnson, the little man seized the opportunity to rebuild and fortify his organization with a renewed vigor, understanding that while the federal threat was diminished, it was not extinct, and that his survival depended on becoming even more insulated, more secretive, and more embedded in the legitimate economy than ever before. He expanded his gambling operations, which were the lifeblood of his empire, solidifying his control over every wire room, every bookie, and every slot machine from Dallas to Miami, while simultaneously pouring millions of his illicit profits into ventures that would gleam with respectability, real estate development, construction companies, food processing plants, and even a foray into the burgeoning oil and gas industry, creating a complex web of corporate entities so convoluted that tracing the money back to its criminal origins became a near impossible task for investigators. This period also saw him deepen his political investments, cultivating a new generation of politicians, sheriffs, and judges who were either unaware of the full extent of his dealings or, more likely, were willing to look the other way for a share of the immense profits his machine generated, ensuring that his protection at the local and state level remained impenetrable even as the federal government licked its wounds. He became a ghost in the machine of Gulf Coast commerce, a whispered name behind major deals, a silent partner in lucrative contracts, his influence so diffuse and carefully laundered that he could plausibly deny any direct involvement while still reaping the enormous rewards, a strategy that allowed him to operate with a brazenness that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. He hosted lavish parties at his Churchill Farms plantation, attended by a who's who of Southern society, business leaders, entertainers, sports figures, and politicians, all mingling freely under the watchful eye of their host, who held court with the quiet authority of a feudal lord, these gatherings serving as a powerful symbol of his restored status and a clear message to the world that Carlos Marcello was not just back, but was more untouchable than ever. This triumphant resurgence, however, was conducted under the perpetual shadow of Dallas, a shadow that grew longer and darker as official investigations gave way to persistent whispers and then to full-throated accusations from journalists, conspiracy theorists, and even official government bodies like the House Select Committee on Assassinations, which would later formally name him as one of the prime suspects with a motive and the potential means to have orchestrated the murder of the president. For Marcello, this meant that while the direct legal pressure from the Justice Department had eased, he was now perpetually in the court of public opinion and historical scrutiny, forced to deny, deflect, and discredit the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence that linked him to the crime of the century, a battle fought not in courtrooms with lawyers, but in the pages of books and on television screens with spokesmen and carefully crafted statements of innocence. He cultivated an image of a simple, misunderstood businessman, a family man who was being persecuted by sensationalists and opportunists, but the steely resolve and the capacity for cold fury never left him, and those who knew him best understood that beneath the veneer of southern gentility was a man who had survived every attempt to break him and who would continue to do so by any means necessary. A resilience that would be tested one final time as a new generation of federal prosecutors, armed with revolutionary laws and an unwavering determination, began to assemble a case that would not rely on deportation or tax evasion, but on the very words he spoke in the privacy of his own inner sanctum. The respite granted by the tragedy of 1963 was, therefore, not an end to his troubles, but merely an intermission, a 2-decade-long Indian summer of power and prosperity that allowed him to build his empire to its zenith, but which also sowed the seeds for his ultimate downfall, as the technological prowess of law enforcement finally began to catch up with his old-world methods of secrecy, and the one vulnerability he could never fully eliminate, the human desire to talk, to boast, to confess, would finally be exploited in a way that would bring the entire towering edifice of his life's work crashing down around him. The Indian summer of Carlos Marcello's power, that long and prosperous stretch from the mid-1960s through the 1970s, was a masterclass in the corporatization of crime, a period where he refined his empire into a model of efficiency and insulation that future generations of criminals would study but rarely replicate, a system where the violence of his youth was now a tool of last resort, delegated to trusted lieutenants and carried out in the deep swamps far from the prying eyes of the modern surveillance state that was slowly taking shape around him. His primary revenue stream remained the intricate and sprawling gambling network that functioned with the precision of a Fortune 500 company, complete with regional managers, accountants, and couriers who moved millions in cash from local wire rooms and bookmaking operations to a central counting house, where the money was sorted, recorded with an almost obsessive attention to detail that would have impressed any legitimate auditor, and then filtered through his labyrinth of shell corporations and front businesses, emerging as clean, taxable income that funded his lavish public lifestyle and his even more substantial secret investments. He understood the power of the legitimate world and sought to conquer it not through intimidation alone, but through economic dominance, becoming a silent partner in construction firms that won lucrative public works contracts, a hidden force in the hotel and hospitality industry that gave him control over key real estate and the unions that serviced them, and a shadow banker to other businesses who needed capital and were willing to overlook its origins, thereby weaving his financial influence into the very economic fabric of the region so completely that to attack him was to risk destabilizing the economy itself. This era also saw him become a godfather in the truest sense of the word, presiding over a vast and interconnected network of criminal associates and corrupt officials that stretched far beyond the borders of Louisiana, maintaining close alliances with the powerful crime families in Chicago, Cleveland, and New York, relationships built on mutual respect and a clear understanding of territorial boundaries, ensuring that his operations ran smoothly without interference and that he could call upon immense resources from across the country if a significant problem ever arose. His personal life mirrored this duality, living a life of stark contrasts between the opulently public and the secretively brutal. He was a devoted family man, seen at church with his wife and children, hosting extravagant Christmas parties for his grandchildren at his mansion, while simultaneously presiding over a meeting in a remote corner of his Churchill Farms plantation where the fate of a disloyal associate was being decided with a quiet nod that would lead to a permanent disappearance into the alligator-infested bayous. It was during this period that the federal government's approach began its own evolution, shifting from the direct, personal vendetta of the Kennedy era to a more systematic, technologically advanced, and patient strategy, with the FBI slowly piecing together the puzzle of his empire through the new tool of RICO, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, a revolutionary piece of legislation that finally allowed prosecutors to attack the entire criminal enterprise as a continuing criminal conspiracy, rather than nabbing its foot soldiers for isolated crimes. The key to making RICO stick, however, was no longer just physical surveillance or financial records, it was the human voice, the unguarded confession, the careless boast, and to get it, the FBI launched one of the most ambitious and technically complex undercover operations in its history, planting a listening device not in a room or a car, but in the very heart of his power. His own office at the Town and Country Motel, a bug so sensitive and well hidden that for years it transmitted the most intimate details of his criminal operations directly to the eager ears of federal agents. This electronic eavesdropping, combined with the cultivation of a high-level informant within his inner circle, began to produce the kind of evidence that previous generations of prosecutors could only dream of: direct recordings of Marcello discussing bribes to public officials, ordering acts of intimidation, and laying out the complex financial structure of his syndicate. A slow-motion avalanche of self-incrimination that was meticulously catalogued and stored, building the foundation for a case that was designed not to harass him, but to bury him. Yet, even as the net was being woven, Marcello's instinct for survival remained razor-sharp. He could feel the changing currents, the subtle shift in the tactics of his enemies, and he began to retreat further into his shell, trusting fewer people, speaking in even more cryptic codes, and relying on his decades-old armor of political protection to shield him from the gathering storm. A storm he believed he could weather as he had all the others, unaware that this time, the government was not just armed with a new law, but with the one thing he could not control: his own words, spoken in confidence and now captured on tape, waiting for the right moment to be played back to a jury that would decide the fate of the last of the great old-world crime lords. The final, decisive assault on the fortress of Carlos Marcello began not with a dramatic raid or a sensational arrest, but with the quiet, methodical work of a small team of FBI agents and federal prosecutors who had dedicated years of their lives to the singular goal of assembling a case so overwhelming and so meticulously documented that it would finally penetrate the layers of political protection, legal obfuscation, and ingrained fear that had shielded him for half a century. The centerpiece of this monumental effort was the treasure trove of evidence captured by the hidden microphone, codenamed BRILAB, planted in his office, a device that had faithfully transmitted thousands of hours of conversations, painting an audio portrait of a criminal executive at work, managing his empire with the cold detachment of a CEO, but whose business was corruption, extortion, and violence. These tapes were the Rosetta Stone for deciphering the complex language of his syndicate, allowing investigators to connect cryptic phrases and seemingly innocent nicknames to specific criminal acts, to identify previously unknown associates, and to map the entire financial flow of his organization from the street-level bookie all the way up to the man at the top. The conversations captured were a stunning mix of the banal and the brutal, ranging from detailed discussions about the price of bribing a state senator to ensure favorable legislation, to complaints about the quality of food at one of his restaurants, to chillingly casual orders relayed to his brother Joe to have a problematic individual taken care of, a euphemism that everyone in the room understood meant a one-way trip to the marshes. For years, agents sat in listening posts, transcribing every word, building a mountain of evidence that detailed not just individual crimes, but the entire enterprise, as defined by the RICO statute, proving a pattern of racketeering activity that was the very lifeblood of Marcello's power. This audio surveillance was complemented by the most dangerous threat to any criminal organization, a high-level informant, someone from within Marcello's trusted inner circle who, whether out of self-preservation, a plea deal, or a sudden attack of conscience, decided to turn against the boss and provide the context and corroboration for the cryptic conversations on the tapes. This dual-pronged approach, the cold, impartial eye of technology and the damning, narrative-driven testimony of a traitor, created a case that was virtually impervious to the traditional defenses of witness intimidation and juror manipulation, as the star witness was not a person who could be threatened, but a magnetic tape that could not be cross-examined and would not change its story. The culmination of this decade-long investigation was a sprawling, multi-count federal indictment in 1981 that read like the history of organized crime in the South, charging Carlos Marcello and his top lieutenants with a sweeping list of crimes including racketeering, conspiracy, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice, a legal document that sought to put not just the man, but his entire era, on trial. The trial itself was a spectacle, a dramatic showdown between the ailing kingpin, now in his 70s, and the relentless machinery of the modern Justice Department, with prosecutors playing the secret recordings for the jury, the room filling with Marcello's own distinctive, gravelly voice calmly discussing bribes and brutal retaliations. A moment of profound vulnerability for a man who had built his life on secrecy and control. His defense team, still well-funded and skilled, fought back with every tool available, attacking the credibility of the informant, challenging the legality of the wiretaps, and portraying Marcello as an elderly, misunderstood businessman being persecuted for the ambitions of overzealous prosecutors, but the evidence was simply too pervasive, too detailed, and too damning to be explained away. The jury, after deliberating on the mountain of evidence, returned with a verdict of guilty on all major counts, a stunning blow that echoed through the courtrooms and social clubs of the American underworld, signaling the end of an era where a man like Carlos Marcello could operate with such impunity. The subsequent sentencing hearing was the final act of this long drama, with the once untouchable crime boss, now a convicted felon, standing before a federal judge who looked down upon him not as a legend or a folk hero, but as a common criminal, and delivered a sentence that would have been unthinkable at the height of his power: 17 years in a federal penitentiary, a virtual life sentence for a man of his age and declining health, a decree that effectively slammed the prison gates shut on the nearly 5-decade reign of the little man, and served as the official epitaph for his empire. The fall of Carlos Marcello was not a sudden collapse but a slow, inexorable crumbling, a drawn-out process of legal appeals and deteriorating health that mirrored the fading of the old-world mafia itself, a subculture he had so perfectly embodied and which was now being systematically dismantled by the very RICO laws that had finally ensnared him. His entry into the federal prison system was a profound humiliation, a reduction of a king to an inmate number, forced to follow the monotonous and rigid routines of institutional life, a stark contrast to the absolute autonomy he had enjoyed for decades on his plantation and in his restaurants where his every whim was a command. The Bureau of Prisons, aware of his legendary status and his vast network of contacts on the outside, classified him as a high-security risk, ensuring his confinement was in some of the most secure penitentiaries in the country, far from the familiar humidity of Louisiana, in cold, impersonal fortresses where his name commanded no special fear and his money could not buy his freedom. Behind the walls, the man who had once dined with politicians and corrupted entire judicial systems was now just another elderly prisoner, his power evaporating with each passing day, his empire left leaderless and vulnerable to the infighting, raids, and ambitious rivals that inevitably follow the vacuum left by a fallen king. His health, both physical and mental, began a steep and irreversible decline. The sharp, strategic mind that had outmaneuvered the FBI for so long was now clouded by the onset of dementia, a cruel irony for a man whose greatest weapon had always been his cunning, his ability to think 10 steps ahead of his adversaries, now trapped in a confusing present, his legendary memory failing him, his past receding into a fog from which he could not escape. His family and dwindling number of loyalists fought a protracted legal battle for his release on compassionate grounds, arguing that the frail, sick old man in a prison hospital bed was no longer a threat to anyone, a shadow of the formidable figure he once had been, but the federal government, remembering the decades of terror and corruption, was unmoved, determined that he would live out his final days within the confines of the system he had so brilliantly and brutally defied. He was eventually transferred to a federal medical center, a prison hospital where he was confined to a bed, surrounded not by loyal soldiers but by nurses and orderlies. His world shrunk to the four walls of a room, a far cry from the sprawling acres of Churchill Farms where he had once held absolute sway, a poignant and pathetic end for a man of such immense ambition and power. It was in this sterile, controlled environment, a world away from the vibrant, chaotic streets of Little Palermo where his story began, that Carlos Marcello took his final breath in 1993, his death not marking the end of a dynasty, for his empire had long since fractured and dissolved, but rather the closing of a specific, dark chapter in American history, the final page in the story of the feudal lords of organized crime who ruled their territories with an iron fist. His funeral, while a private and somber affair for his family, was a symbolic event, attended by a curious mix of grieving relatives, aging associates whose own power had faded with time, and a small army of reporters and federal agents who came to bear witness to the undeniable fact of his passing, to confirm that the legend was finally, truly gone. There were no grandiose public displays, no eulogies that spoke of his criminal accomplishments. The man who had been a constant, ominous presence in the American consciousness for so long was laid to rest with a quietude that belied the seismic impact of his life, his legacy left not in the hands of a successor, but in the hands of historians, journalists, and the thousands of pages of FBI files that would forever tell the tale of his rise and fall. The world he left behind was one he would scarcely recognize, a world where the kind of hands-on, geographically rooted criminal empire he built was becoming obsolete, replaced by more decentralized, globalized, and digital forms of crime, a new era where the name Carlos Marcello would slowly transition from a living threat to a historical footnote, a subject for documentaries and true crime podcasts. His story a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the relentless, if often delayed, pursuit of justice. The legacy of Carlos Marcello is a complex and shadowy tapestry woven with threads of immense power, brutal violence, sophisticated corruption, and a lingering, unsettling mystery that continues to haunt the corridors of American history, a legacy that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of power, the fragility of justice, and the hidden forces that can shape the destiny of a nation. His story is the ultimate blueprint of how organized crime could successfully infiltrate and metastasize within the American body politic, not through a dramatic revolution, but through the patient, relentless cultivation of weakness and greed at every level of society, from the beat cop on the street to the highest offices in the State House, proving that the most effective criminal is not the one who threatens the system, but the one who becomes an indispensable, if hidden, part of its machinery. The empire he built was a testament to a specific kind of genius, a ruthless understanding of human nature that allowed him to build a financial and political infrastructure so resilient that it withstood countless legal challenges, the personal vendetta of an attorney general, and the changing tides of public morality for the better part of 5 decades, an achievement in criminal longevity that remains unmatched in the annals of the American underworld. Yet, this same legacy is irrevocably stained by the blood of countless unnamed victims, the lives ruined by his narcotics trade, the businesses extorted into submission, the careers of public servants destroyed by his corruption, and the climate of fear he instilled in an entire region, a dark underbelly that serves as a grim reminder of the human cost of his quest for power. And then, of course, there is the eternal, unanswerable question that will forever be synonymous with his name. Was Carlos Marcello the hidden architect behind the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? The official record may never provide a definitive answer, but the circumstantial case is powerfully compelling. He had a motive of existential proportions, a proven network of violent operatives, deep connections to the anti-Castro Cubans who populate so many conspiracy theories, and perhaps most damningly, he expressed the specific, metaphorical intent to kill the head of the dog, to stop its bites. This single, unresolved aspect of his life elevates him from a regional crime boss to a figure of potentially world historical significance, a man who may have, from his base in the Louisiana swamps, altered the trajectory of the 20th century, a shadowy possibility that ensures his story will be debated and investigated for generations to come. Beyond the specter of Dallas, his life offers a masterclass in the art of survival, demonstrating a chameleon-like ability to adapt to every new threat, from the gang wars of his youth to the technological surveillance of his old age, constantly evolving his methods, refining his insulation, and demonstrating a resilience that bordered on the supernatural, until the very laws of the nation had to be rewritten specifically to combat the kind of empire he represented. In the end, the story of Carlos Marcello is the story of modern America itself, a tale of immigrant ambition twisted into ruthless enterprise, of the complex relationship between crime and politics, of the enduring battle between law and order and the entrepreneurial spirit of the underworld, and of the haunting possibility that the most pivotal moments in our history may not be accidents of fate, but the calculated results of actions taken by men operating in the shadows we never fully see. His death did not end his influence, it merely transferred it from the realm of active threat to the realm of eternal caution, a case study for law enforcement agencies around the world on the perils of allowing a criminal enterprise to put down deep roots, and a sobering lesson for citizens on the constant vigilance required to protect their institutions from the silent, patient, and insidious corrosion of corruption. He remains the ghost in the machine of the Gulf South, his name whispered in the context of unsolved murders and unexplained political favors, his shadow still faintly visible in the architecture of power in New Orleans and beyond, a permanent part of the landscape he once ruled with such absolute and fearsome authority. The final call to action for us, the audience, is to remember, to research, and to question, to look beyond the official narratives and understand the complex, often dark, forces that have shaped our world, for it is only by understanding the Carlos Marcellos of history that we can hope to recognize their successors and prevent them from ever building such an untouchable empire again. To truly grasp the monumental scale of Carlos Marcello's criminal empire is to abandon all preconceived notions of a gangster's life and instead to understand it as a vast, shadow government operating in perfect synchrony with the legitimate one, a parallel society with its own laws, its own economy, and its own unwavering system of justice, all flowing from the unwavering authority of a single man whose word was, in his world, final and absolute. This empire's financial engine was a masterpiece of illicit enterprise, a diversified portfolio of crime that generated revenue streams so consistent and massive they rivaled those of legitimate corporations, with the lifeblood being illegal gambling, a network that stretched across the Gulf Coast like an invisible web, encompassing thousands of bookmakers taking bets on everything from horse races and sports games to political elections, each one kicking a substantial percentage of their profits up the chain through a sophisticated system of couriers and middlemen until it all coalesced into a river of cash that flowed directly into Marcello's coffers. But gambling was merely the foundation. Built upon it were the towering structures of loan sharking, where desperate individuals and even businesses were offered capital at exorbitant interest rates enforced not by legal contracts but by the very real threat of broken bones or worse, and labor racketeering, where his control over key unions, particularly the Teamsters, allowed him to extort massive payoffs from businesses in exchange for labor peace, to loot union pension funds for his own investments, and to paralyze entire industries with the mere threat of a strike, giving him a stranglehold on the economic throat of the region. Beyond these traditional rackets was the more sinister and immensely profitable world of narcotics, a trade Marcello publicly denied but which federal investigators proved he supervised with meticulous care, using his control of the port of New Orleans to facilitate the importation of heroin and other drugs, distributing them through a network that reached into every major city in the United States, a trade that destroyed countless lives but which poured millions upon millions of untaxed dollars into his war chest, money that was then laundered through a dizzying array of front businesses, vending machine companies, restaurants, pecan shelling plants, and real estate developments, that scrubbed the cash clean and allowed it to be reinvested into both legitimate ventures and further political corruption. This corruption was the empire's immune system, a network of bribes and favors that protected it from external threats, a system so thoroughly embedded that mayors, sheriffs, state legislators, and even judges were effectively on his payroll, either through direct cash payments, lucrative no-show jobs for their relatives, or the delivery of blocks of votes that could make or break a political career, creating an environment where law enforcement would often tip him off to impending raids, where indictments would be mysteriously lost or delayed, and where any serious challenger would find their campaigns suddenly starved of funds and support. The administration of this vast territory was run with the efficiency of a general staff, with Marcello at the top, his brother Joseph as his trusted chief of staff, and a descending hierarchy of lieutenants, capos, and soldiers, each responsible for a specific geographic area or criminal specialty, each expected to meet revenue quotas and maintain order. With disputes brought before Marcello himself for arbitration, his decision accepted without question, his authority absolute and reinforced by the ever-present threat of the Black Hand, of violence that could strike down anyone, anywhere, who dared to challenge his rule or betray his code of silence. This was the empire in its prime, a self-sustaining ecosystem of power and profit that seemed utterly impervious to attack, a machine that fed on the weaknesses of the society around it and grew stronger with each passing year, a testament to one man's vision of building a criminal enterprise so deeply intertwined with the fabric of everyday life that to remove it would risk tearing the entire social fabric apart, a calculation that for decades proved correct and allowed Carlos Marcello to reign as the undisputed, untouchable king of a hidden America that thrived in the shadows just beyond the light of the law. The intricate machinery of Carlos Marcello's empire, for all its sophistication and ruthless efficiency, possessed a critical and ultimately fatal vulnerability that was not in its structure, but in its very soul, the inescapable human frailties of greed, fear, and the irrepressible need to speak, to confess, to boast, a flaw that the federal government, after decades of failure, finally learned to exploit with devastating effectiveness through technological means and a new understanding of the psychological pressures that could turn a loyal soldier into a cooperative witness. This shift in strategy marked the end of the old-fashioned gangster era and the beginning of a new, more clinical war on crime, one fought not with Tommy guns in the streets but with hidden microphones, complex financial audits, and the promise of witness protection, tools that bypassed the traditional armor of intimidation and political protection that Marcello had spent a lifetime constructing. The BRILAB wiretap was the technological masterstroke, a listening device so sensitive and well concealed within the confines of his own inner sanctum that it captured the empire's CEO in his most unguarded moments, his voice, once the source of unshakable commands, now becoming the primary evidence for his own destruction. His words meticulously transcribed and catalogued by teams of FBI agents who for the first time could hear the direct line from a command given in a whispered conversation to its violent execution on the streets. These tapes provided an unprecedented audio roadmap to the entire organization, revealing not just the crimes themselves but the intricate culture of the syndicate, the nicknames, the codes, the subtle inflections that signaled approval or doom, and the casual, almost bureaucratic manner in which violence and corruption were discussed and delegated, stripping away the romanticized myth of the honorable gangster and revealing the cold, calculating business reality beneath. Yet, technology alone was not enough. It required a human key to decipher the code, and that key was provided by the turncoats, the high-level associates who, faced with the certainty of long prison sentences and the new, terrifying weapon of RICO indictments that threatened to take everything they and their families owned, made the rational choice to save themselves by testifying against the man they had once sworn to obey without question. The Witness Protection Program offered these men a new identity and a chance at life, something Marcello could never counter, as his power was rooted in a specific geography and a network of personal loyalty that became meaningless when a witness was relocated to an anonymous suburb on the other side of the country, their old lives erased, their testimony delivered from behind a screen or through a voice modulator, their former boss unable to reach them with his once formidable reach. This combination of irrefutable electronic evidence and the damning, contextual testimony of insiders created a prosecutorial tool of unimaginable power, a pincer movement that squeezed the life out of the Marcello organization, as the boss and his top lieutenants were no longer fighting individual charges of tax evasion or assault, but a sweeping narrative of a continuing criminal enterprise, a story told to the jury through their own voices and the words of their closest friends. The courtroom during the 1981 trial became the stage for the empire's final, public unraveling, as prosecutors played tape after tape of Marcello's own voice, a spectral presence in the room that detailed bribes, ordered beatings, and discussed the financial intricacies of his illicit kingdom, while on the stand, former associates, their faces masked, their voices distorted, pointed a finger at the aging man in the defendant's chair and laid bare the inner workings of his world. For Marcello, this was the ultimate betrayal and the most profound defeat. He was not being outsmarted in the streets or outbribed in the halls of power, he was being deconstructed by the very tools of modern society he had never fully mastered, electronics and federal statutes, and by the fundamental weakness of the human bonds he had believed were forged in iron and blood. The guilty verdict was therefore more than a legal judgment, it was the validation of a new era in law enforcement, proving that no criminal, no matter how powerful, insulated, or feared, was beyond the reach of a patient, technologically sophisticated, and relentless investigation that targeted the organization itself as the enemy, rather than just the individuals within it. This was the legacy Marcello left for the underworld, a blueprint not for building an empire, but for its inevitable fall, a lesson that the same society that could be corrupted could also adapt, innovate, and eventually, with the right tools and the right laws, reclaim its institutions from the shadow of a king. The final years of Carlos Marcello's life, spent behind the unyielding walls of federal prisons and ultimately a sterile medical facility, represent a profound and tragic denouement to a saga of almost mythical power, a slow-motion erosion of a titan that stripped him of everything that had defined his existence, his authority, his autonomy, his sharp-witted cunning, and finally, even the memories of the empire he had built. His incarceration was not merely a loss of freedom but a systematic dismantling of his identity, as the man who had once commanded a private army and dined with political kingmakers was now subject to the shrill commands of correctional officers, his daily life reduced to a monotonous cycle of headcounts, meal lines, and confined recreation in a concrete yard. An existence so alien and demeaning that it must have felt like a form of psychological torture for a spirit as fiercely independent as his. The federal prison system, designed to break men of far lesser will, applied its full, impersonal force upon him, isolating him from the remaining loyalists who might still seek his counsel, monitoring his every communication with the outside world, and ensuring that the name Carlos Marcello held no special power within this grim, egalitarian universe of concrete and steel. As the appeals from his legal team dragged on through the courts, each one meeting with rejection, the reality of his situation must have settled upon him with a crushing weight, the realization that the legal system he had so masterfully manipulated and evaded for 5 decades had finally, irrevocably, captured him, and that there would be no daring escape, no clever legal loophole, no politically connected miracle to set him free this time. The most devastating blow, however, was the gradual but relentless advance of dementia, a thief in the night that began to steal the very essence of the man, clouding the brilliant strategic mind that had constructed a criminal masterpiece, erasing the intricate details of his own history, and leaving him increasingly confused, disoriented, and trapped in a fading present. One can only imagine the haunting interior landscape of his final years, moments of lucidity where the full scope of his fall would crystallize with terrifying clarity, followed by long periods of fog where the past and present merged into a confusing tapestry, perhaps seeing not the prison nurse but a long-dead associate, or believing he was back at his Churchill Farms plantation rather than in a prison hospital bed. His transfer to the Federal Medical Center in Springfield, Missouri, was the final acknowledgement that the once formidable, little man, was now just a patient, a frail, sick old man requiring round-the-clock medical care, his body and mind failing in unison, a pathetic figure whose vulnerability stood in stark contrast to the terror his name had once inspired. It was here, in this clinical environment dedicated to managing the end of life for the nation's prisoners, that he took his final breath in 1993, his death not a dramatic event that shook the underworld, but a quiet, administrative conclusion to a case file that had been open for most of the century. His passing marked the definitive end of an era, the closing of the book on the kind of geographically based, politically entrenched crime lord he exemplified, a model that was already being supplanted by more fluid and globalized criminal networks. The empire died long before the man, its structure shattered by RICO, its leadership decimated by indictments and turncoats, its operations fragmented and absorbed by lesser, more discreet criminals, leaving Marcello's final years to be not those of a retired king, but of a solitary, broken relic, a living ghost whose time had passed, a poignant and solemn reminder that all power, no matter how absolute or fearfully held, is ultimately transient, and that the relentless march of time and justice eventually claims even the most untouchable of men, reducing their legends to whispers and their formidable lives to a quiet, lonely end in a room far from the world they once ruled. To understand the true, enduring impact of Carlos Marcello on the American criminal and political landscape is to look beyond the man himself and to examine the void he left behind, a void that was not filled by a single successor but that fragmented into a new, more chaotic and less predictable era of criminal enterprise, while simultaneously forcing a fundamental restructuring of how the nation's law enforcement agencies approached the very concept of organized crime. His downfall, engineered by the RICO statute, did not eliminate crime from the Gulf Coast, rather, it dismantled the centralized, quasi-governmental structure that had imposed a strange kind of order on the underworld, a system where disputes were settled by Marcello's arbitration and territorial boundaries were respected, which in its own dark way prevented the kind of violent, internecine street wars that can plague criminal ecosystems without a strong, central authority. With the king toppled, his kingdom shattered into a collection of competing fiefdoms, smaller, more volatile gangs and independent operators who lacked his strategic vision and political finesse, leading to sporadic bursts of violence as these new groups fought for control of the lucrative rackets he once monopolized, a period of instability that, while challenging for law enforcement in its unpredictability, also meant that no single criminal would ever again wield the same comprehensive, region-wide power that Marcello had enjoyed for so long. This fragmentation was a direct result of the new legal tools he had inspired, for the RICO Act became the blueprint for dismantling every major American crime family in the decades that followed, from New York to Chicago, proving that the model of a corporate-style criminal syndicate was now vulnerable to a law that treated the organization itself as the defendant. His life and career became the foundational case study for the FBI, a textbook example of how to build a case not on a single murder or a specific robbery, but on the pattern of behavior, the financial web, and the testimony of those within the inner circle, lessons that are now standard procedure in any major organized crime investigation anywhere in the developed world. Politically, his legacy was one of profound shame and reform, forcing a long, hard look at the corruption that had festered in Louisiana and other southern states, leading to eventual, if slow, reforms in campaign finance, policing, and political ethics. Though the cynicism he so expertly exploited never fully disappeared, it merely found new, less obvious outlets. For the city of New Orleans and the state of Louisiana, his name remains a dark stain on their history, a symbol of a time when the line between government and gangsterism was not just blurred but often completely erased, a cautionary tale told not to glorify his power but to warn future generations of the perils of unchecked corruption and the seductive danger of the easy money that his empire represented. And on a national scale, his story is forever intertwined with the greatest unsolved mystery of the 20th century, ensuring his place not just in the annals of crime, but in the endless, haunting debate over the assassination of President Kennedy, a debate that continues to fuel books, documentaries, and public fascination, making Carlos Marcello a perpetual figure of historical inquiry and dark speculation. His life, therefore, serves as a complex and enduring lesson, a testament to the terrifying heights of power that can be achieved through ruthlessness and intelligence, but also a stark demonstration of the inevitable vulnerabilities of such power, and a reminder that the American system, for all its flaws and susceptibility to corruption, possesses a slow-moving but ultimately formidable capacity for self-correction, capable of evolving new laws and new strategies to confront even its most deeply entrenched and seemingly untouchable enemies. The story of Carlos Marcello is, in its final analysis, the story of the American experiment itself, a constant, often violent, struggle between the forces of order and chaos, between public good and private greed, a struggle that is never truly won, but must be fought anew by every generation, armed with the knowledge of the past and a vigilant eye on the shadows where the next empire may already be beginning to form. The personal psychology of Carlos Marcello remains as complex and shrouded in mystery as the most clandestine of his criminal dealings, a fascinating study in contrasts that saw a man capable of immense, calculated brutality also display a fierce, traditional devotion to family, a man who orchestrated a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise yet never lost the rough, uneducated speech patterns of the New Orleans streets that forged him, a figure who projected an image of calm, almost detached authority while harboring a volcanic temper that could erupt with terrifying suddenness when his will was challenged or his authority questioned. This duality was the very engine of his longevity, the family man who hosted lavish, traditional Italian gatherings for his children and grandchildren provided a veneer of normalcy and respectability that made him seem less threatening to the outside world and fostered a cult-like loyalty within his own organization, where he was not just a boss but a patriarch, a provider. A man who took care of his own with generosity and unwavering support, so long as their loyalty was absolute and their obedience complete. Yet, this same man could, without a flicker of visible emotion, order the torture and execution of a friend turned informant or a business partner who had skimmed from the profits, viewing such acts not as personal vendettas but as necessary corporate governance, the cold, clinical pruning required to maintain the health and security of the larger organization. A dispassionate approach to violence that made him even more fearsome than the more theatrically violent gangsters of his era. His intelligence was not of the academic kind, but a native, street-honed cunning, an almost preternatural ability to read men, to identify their weaknesses, their ambitions, and their price, whether they were a corruptible sheriff or a rival gangster, and to exploit those flaws with the precision of a master strategist, playing individuals and institutions against each other in a complex game where he was always thinking several moves ahead. This was combined with a phenomenal memory for details, financial figures, personal anecdotes, past favors, and simmering grudges, that allowed him to manage his vast empire without keeping extensive written records, storing the entire blueprint of his organization in his mind, a living database of corruption and connection that proved largely immune to traditional law enforcement methods for most of his career. His legendary distrust, a trait that deepened into near paranoia in his later years, was both his greatest strength and his ultimate weakness. It protected him from countless stings and betrayals, forcing him to operate in a tight circle of trust that made it difficult for outsiders to penetrate his inner world, but it also isolated him, preventing the kind of delegation that could have ensured the stability of his empire beyond his own lifespan and making him increasingly reliant on a shrinking number of confidants, a vulnerability that the FBI would eventually exploit. His view of the world was fundamentally feudal. He saw himself as the rightful lord of his territory, and the taxes he collected from illegal activities were, in his mind, simply his due, the revenue owed to the sovereign for the privilege of operating within his domain, a perspective that explains his utter contempt for the federal government, which he saw as an outside, illegitimate power trying to impose its will on his kingdom, an arrogant interloper that deserved neither his respect nor his obedience. This mindset fueled his epic battles against deportation and his relentless war with the Kennedy administration, which he perceived not as a legal process but as a personal challenge to his sovereignty, a battle for his very right to exist and rule in the land he considered his own. The deep-seated anger that simmered beneath his calm exterior was not just a product of this conflict, but was rooted in the humiliations and struggles of his impoverished childhood in Little Palermo, a burning desire to never again be powerless, to never again be at the mercy of a system that looked down on immigrants like him, a drive that fueled his ruthless ambition and his insatiable appetite for control, making his ascent to power a personal crusade to rewrite the narrative of his own life from a marginalized outsider to the most powerful man in the room, a man whose quietest whisper could command life and death. Understanding this intricate and often contradictory psychological portrait is essential to moving beyond the simplistic caricature of a gangster and appreciating the formidable, deeply flawed, and historically significant figure that Carlos Marcello truly was, a man who was, in the end, a product of his time and his environment, who seized the opportunities that a corrupt system presented and forged them into an empire of shadow and substance, a legacy that continues to challenge our understanding of power, justice, and the American dream itself. The operational security and communication protocols that Carlos Marcello implemented throughout his empire were a testament to his profound understanding of secrecy and his near-instinctual grasp of counter-surveillance techniques long before such concepts became formalized in law enforcement training, creating a system of command and control that was so effective it allowed him to operate in plain sight while leaving behind a frustratingly small paper trail for investigators to follow. At the heart of this system was his famous aversion to telephones, which he rightly suspected were being tapped by federal agents, leading him to conduct his most sensitive business exclusively in person, often while walking slowly through the crowds at the New Orleans French Market or driving aimlessly on the back roads of Jefferson Parish with his trusted lieutenants, his car periodically stopping in secluded areas to allow for brief, hushed conversations before moving again, a mobile office that was virtually impossible to bug effectively. When face-to-face meetings were too risky or logistically difficult, he relied on a small army of trusted couriers, often older, nondescript individuals who attracted little attention, to carry verbal messages or cryptic handwritten notes between key players, a method that was slow but almost completely secure from electronic eavesdropping, ensuring that the most incriminating orders never left the realm of the spoken word or were written in a code that was meaningless to anyone outside his innermost circle. His choice of meeting places was equally deliberate, favoring open-air locations like his sprawling Churchill Farms plantation where the wide, flat fields made it impossible for anyone to approach undetected, or the noisy, chaotic confines of his town and country restaurant where the clatter of dishes and the buzz of conversation provided a natural audio shield against any hidden microphones that might have been planted. He cultivated a network of lookouts and corrupt officials within the police and sheriff's departments who would provide him with early warnings of any impending raids or the planting of surveillance devices, giving him and his associates crucial time to change their plans, sanitize their meeting places, and ensure that any evidence was destroyed or removed before the authorities could arrive with their search warrants. His financial operations were a masterpiece of obfuscation, with cash moving through a dizzying array of shell companies, offshore bank accounts, and legitimate-looking businesses whose ledgers were a labyrinth of false entries and fabricated transactions, designed to confuse and frustrate even the most determined IRS auditor. A system so complex that it took teams of federal accountants years to unravel even a fraction of the money flow. He enforced a strict policy of compartmentalization within his organization, where soldiers and mid-level managers were only given information essential to their specific tasks, ensuring that no single individual, if flipped by the authorities, could bring down the entire enterprise or provide a complete picture of its scope and structure, a corporate model of need-to-know secrecy that protected the core leadership. His own personal habits reinforced this culture of secrecy. He was a man of few words, often speaking in a mumbled, heavily accented jargon that was difficult for outsiders to understand, and he used a vocabulary of euphemisms and coded phrases where a problem meant a person who needed to be killed, a shipment referred to narcotics, and taking care of business could mean anything from a simple arson to a complex act of political bribery, a linguistic shield that provided him with plausible deniability even if his conversations were recorded. This entire, intricate architecture of secrecy was not just a defensive measure, it was an offensive weapon that allowed him to project an image of invincibility and omniscience, making his subordinates and rivals believe that he was always one step ahead, that he had eyes and ears everywhere, and that any attempt to betray him would be instantly known and mercilessly punished, a perception that was as crucial to maintaining his power as the actual violence he could command. This relentless focus on operational security is what made him such a formidable and elusive target for so long, forcing the FBI to innovate and develop new, more sophisticated methods of investigation, ultimately leading to the high-stakes gamble of planting a long-term listening device in his inner sanctum, a move that was as much an act of desperation as it was of brilliance, born from the realization that traditional police work would never be enough to penetrate the silent, disciplined, and paranoid world that Carlos Marcello had built around himself like a fortress without walls. The immense fortune that Carlos Marcello accumulated over his nearly 6-decade-long criminal career represents one of the most shadowy and elusive aspects of his legacy, a vast and fluid reservoir of wealth that was so expertly hidden, laundered, and reinvested that its true total value likely died with him, known only to the man himself and perhaps a handful of his most trusted financial handlers who have long since vanished into history or taken their secrets to the grave. This was not wealth displayed in the form of flashy jewelry or a collection of exotic sports cars, though he lived comfortably and owned substantial property. Rather, it was capital in its most powerful and silent form, a tool used to purchase influence, ensure silence, and build an ever-thickening armor of legitimacy around his criminal core. A financial engine that powered his entire operation and allowed him to weather economic downturns, legal battles, and the constant, draining costs of systemic corruption. The primary source of this fortune was, of course, his illegal empire, a relentless cash-generating machine that included the millions skimmed from his gambling syndicate, the exorbitant profits from loan sharking where interest rates could exceed 100%, the massive kickbacks from union corruption and control over the New Orleans ports, and the immense revenues from narcotics trafficking, which despite his public denials, formed a cornerstone of his financial power, providing a river of cash that was both voluminous and, due to its illicit nature, incredibly difficult to manage and clean. The process of laundering this staggering inflow of dirty money was a criminal art form in itself, involving a complex and multi-layered system where cash was first placed into the financial system through his myriad of cash-intensive front businesses like bars, restaurants, and vending machine companies, where illicit proceeds were commingled with legitimate earnings, making it nearly impossible to separate the two. The next stage, layering, involved moving these now partially cleaned funds through a dizzying array of shell corporations, often registered in the names of relatives or straw owners, with bank accounts in places like Switzerland, the Caribbean, and Central America, a global shell game designed to confuse auditors and break the paper trail, transferring money from one entity to another until its criminal origins were obscured beyond recognition. Finally, the integration phase saw this now laundered money reintroduced into the legitimate economy as clean, investable capital, which Marcello used to purchase vast tracts of real estate, including his famous Churchill Farms plantation and other properties across Louisiana and Texas, to invest in seemingly legitimate businesses in the oil, gas, and construction industries. and to fund the political campaigns and lavish lifestyles of the politicians and law enforcement officials who were on his payroll, effectively using the profits of crime to buy the very system that was supposed to be hunting him. This financial web was so intricate and well insulated that even after his conviction, the government managed to seize only a fraction of his total wealth, as the bulk of it was tied up in legally held assets under layers of corporate veils and protected by teams of lawyers who could argue that these were the legitimate fruits of his business acumen. A final insult from beyond the prison walls that demonstrated his ultimate victory in one crucial arena. He may have lost his freedom, but he successfully ensured that the full extent of his financial empire would never be truly known, dismantled, or returned to the society it had plundered for so long. This hidden fortune is the ghost of Carlos Marcello, a spectral presence that likely still exists in the form of real estate holdings passed down through family trusts, in dormant offshore accounts, and in business interests whose original seed capital was washed in the blood and suffering of his countless victims, a permanent and poisonous legacy woven into the economic fabric of the Gulf South. A reminder that the most successful crimes are not the ones that make headlines, but the ones that quietly become part of the foundation, their origins forgotten but their influence enduring long after the king who built them has turned to dust. The shadow that Carlos Marcello cast over the American judicial and political systems was not merely one of fear and corruption but also one of profound and lasting institutional change, forcing a reluctant and often myopic federal government to evolve its tactics, rewrite its laws, and fundamentally reconsider its understanding of how criminal power could be organized and perpetuated in the modern age. A legacy of reform born from the sheer magnitude of the threat he represented. His ability to consistently evade justice for decades served as a glaring, undeniable indictment of the limitations of traditional law enforcement, proving that arrests of low-level soldiers and occasional prosecutions for tax evasion were like cutting the heads off a hydra, a futile effort that did nothing to damage the body of the criminal enterprise itself, which would simply regenerate under the same leadership and continue its operations with barely a pause. This frustrating reality was the primary catalyst for the development and eventual passage of the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the famous RICO statute, which was specifically designed to attack the entire structure of a criminal organization by proving a pattern of racketeering activity, allowing prosecutors to connect the dots between seemingly disparate crimes like murder, extortion, and bribery and to treat the entire syndicate as a single, prosecutable entity, a legal revolution that would eventually become the most powerful weapon in the war against organized crime. Marcello's personal war with the Kennedy administration, particularly his humiliating illegal return from deportation, exposed critical weaknesses in federal immigration enforcement and interagency cooperation, leading to tighter controls, better communication between the FBI, the INS, and local authorities, and a new focus on using every available legal tool, no matter how seemingly minor, to apply pressure on high-level targets. His mastery of counter-surveillance and his paranoid operational security directly spurred technological innovation within the FBI, pushing the Bureau to develop more sophisticated and long-term electronic surveillance methods, including the kind of sensitive and risky hidden microphones used in the BRILAB operation, setting new precedents for what was possible and legally permissible in the pursuit of evidence against a target who was too clever to be caught through conventional means. The sheer scale of his political corruption, which reached into the highest levels of Louisiana state government, served as a national wake-up call about the vulnerabilities of local and state politics to organized crime infiltration, leading to a wave of political reforms, increased scrutiny of campaign financing, and the establishment of more robust ethics commissions, though the battle against such corruption remains a perpetual and often frustrating struggle. His case also highlighted the critical importance of witness protection programs, demonstrating that the only way to break the code of omerta was to offer a credible, comprehensive escape plan for insiders who were willing to testify, a strategy that has since become a cornerstone of organized crime prosecutions worldwide, though it was initially met with skepticism by old-school agents who believed in defeating criminals through sheer investigative will rather than making deals with them. Ultimately, Carlos Marcello, the man who sought to operate above the law, became the unwitting architect of its modernization, his life of crime serving as a living laboratory that exposed the flaws in the system and provided the necessary impetus for the creation of a more sophisticated, resilient, and powerful legal arsenal to combat the very kind of empire he had built. The laws and procedures that were refined and tested in the fiery crucible of the pursuit of Carlos Marcello are now standard tools used to dismantle criminal organizations of all kinds, from international drug cartels to human trafficking rings and corporate fraud schemes, proving that his impact, however unintentional, extends far beyond the world of the American mafia and into the very mechanisms of justice that govern the modern world. In this paradoxical way, the man who represented a profound failure of the system for so long ultimately became a primary reason for its strengthening, a dark muse whose criminal genius forced the guardians of order to become smarter, more adaptable, and more relentless, ensuring that while there may always be criminals who seek to build empires in the shadows, the light of the law would now be equipped with sharper tools to find them, expose them, and tear their illicit kingdoms down. The cultural and societal footprint of Carlos Marcello extends far beyond the court transcripts and FBI files, weaving itself into the very mythology of the American underworld and serving as a dark, compelling archetype that has influenced literature, film, and the national imagination, transforming the reality of a ruthless criminal into a symbol of a bygone era of crime that was both more personal and more grandly sinister in its ambitions. He is the ghost that haunts 1,000 gangster narratives, the model for the soft-spoken, deeply entrenched regional kingpin who operates with a quiet authority that is far more terrifying than the flamboyant violence of his counterparts in New York or Chicago, a character type that has become a staple of prestige television and cinematic crime epics, where power is demonstrated not by a loud voice but by a silent, knowing glance that can command life or death. His specific story, of the immigrant who rose from the most humble of beginnings to command a hidden empire, taps into a perverse strand of the American dream, a dark reflection of the Horatio Alger myth where the ladder to success is climbed not through hard work and virtue, but through cunning, brutality, and the systematic corruption of the institutions that are meant to prevent such a rise. A narrative that forces an uncomfortable examination of the fine line between ambitious entrepreneurship and ruthless criminal enterprise. The setting of his empire, the humid, decadent, and morally ambiguous city of New Orleans, with its history of voodoo, its celebration of the macabre, and its long-standing tolerance for vice, provided the perfect backdrop for his reign, a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the legal and the illegal, have always been fluid, making it the only conceivable birthplace for a figure as contradictory and complex as Marcello, and his story has forever cemented the city's reputation as a place where anything can happen, for a price, and where the past is never truly dead, but merely waiting in the shadows. The enduring mystery of his potential involvement in the Kennedy assassination has elevated him from a regional crime figure to a player on the world historical stage, a name that is forever linked to one of the most traumatic and defining events of the 20th century, a connection that ensures his story will be retold and reinvestigated with every new generation, as long as the questions surrounding that day in Dallas remain unanswered. This connection has made him a central figure in a vast universe of conspiracy literature and documentaries, a go-to culprit in 1,000 theories, his image forever frozen in time, a scowling, heavy-set man in a suit, representing the hidden hand of organized crime that may have struck the ultimate blow against the American government, a notion that is both terrifying and perversely satisfying to those who suspect that history is not made by lone lunatics but by powerful, calculating interests operating in the dark. Beyond the conspiracy, his life story serves as a grim civic lesson, a case study taught not in schools but in the collective memory of the Gulf South, a warning about the cost of corruption and the danger of allowing a single individual to amass too much power by understanding the system better than those who are sworn to uphold it, a reminder that the health of a democracy depends on the integrity of its institutions and the vigilance of its citizens. For the people of Louisiana, his name is a part of their history, a dark chapter that is simultaneously a source of shame and a strange, localized pride in the larger-than-life figure who put their state on the map in a way that no politician or business leader ever could, a complicated legacy that is acknowledged with a knowing nod and a lowered voice, a recognition that the past is not just a story but a tangible force that shaped the present in ways that are still being unraveled. In the end, Carlos Marcello has become more than a man, he is a myth, a symbol of a certain kind of American power, hidden, resilient, and utterly immoral, a figure whose true story is now inseparable from the legends that have grown around it, his life a dark tapestry woven from the threads of fact, speculation, and eternal mystery. A narrative that continues to captivate and horrify because it forces us to look into the abyss of what one man is capable of achieving when he is unburdened by conscience and armed with an unwavering will to power. The cultural and societal footprint of Carlos Marcello extends far beyond the court transcripts and FBI files, weaving itself into the very mythology of the American underworld and serving as a dark, compelling archetype that has influenced literature, film, and the national imagination, transforming the reality of a ruthless criminal into a symbol of a bygone era of crime that was both more personal and more grandly sinister in its ambitions. He is the ghost that haunts 1,000 gangster narratives, the model for the soft-spoken, deeply entrenched regional kingpin who operates with a quiet authority that is far more terrifying than the flamboyant violence of his counterparts in New York or Chicago, a character type that has become a staple of prestige television and cinematic crime epics, where power is demonstrated not by a loud voice but by a silent, knowing glance that can command life or death. His specific story, of the immigrant who rose from the most humble of beginnings to command a hidden empire, taps into a perverse strand of the American dream, a dark reflection of the Horatio Alger myth where the ladder to success is climbed not through hard work and virtue, but through cunning, brutality, and the systematic corruption of the institutions that are meant to prevent such a rise. A narrative that forces an uncomfortable examination of the fine line between ambitious entrepreneurship and ruthless criminal enterprise. The setting of his empire, the humid, decadent, and morally ambiguous city of New Orleans, with its history of voodoo, its celebration of the macabre, and its long-standing tolerance for vice, provided the perfect backdrop for his reign, a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the legal and the illegal, have always been fluid, making it the only conceivable birthplace for a figure as contradictory and complex as Marcello, and his story has forever cemented the city's reputation as a place where anything can happen, for a price, and where the past is never truly dead, but merely waiting in the shadows. The enduring mystery of his potential involvement in the Kennedy assassination has elevated him from a regional crime figure to a player on the world historical stage, a name that is forever linked to one of the most traumatic and defining events of the 20th century, a connection that ensures his story will be retold and reinvestigated with every new generation, as long as the questions surrounding that day in Dallas remain unanswered. This connection has made him a central figure in a vast universe of conspiracy literature and documentaries, a go-to culprit in 1,000 theories, his image forever frozen in time, a scowling, heavy-set man in a suit, representing the hidden hand of organized crime that may have struck the ultimate blow against the American government. A notion that is both terrifying and perversely satisfying to those who suspect that history is not made by lone lunatics but by powerful, calculating interests operating in the dark. Beyond the conspiracy, his life story serves as a grim civic lesson, a case study taught not in schools but in the collective memory of the Gulf South, a warning about the cost of corruption and the danger of allowing a single individual to amass too much power by understanding the system better than those who are sworn to uphold it. A reminder that the health of a democracy depends on the integrity of its institutions and the vigilance of its citizens. For the people of Louisiana, his name is a part of their history, a dark chapter that is simultaneously a source of shame and a strange, localized pride in the larger-than-life figure who put their state on the map in a way that no politician or business leader ever could, a complicated legacy that is acknowledged with a knowing nod and a lowered voice. A recognition that the past is not just a story but a tangible force that shaped the present in ways that are still being unraveled. In the end, Carlos Marcello has become more than a man. He is a myth, a symbol of a certain kind of American power, hidden, resilient, and utterly immoral, a figure whose true story is now inseparable from the legends that have grown around it, his life a dark tapestry woven from the threads of fact, speculation, and eternal mystery. A narrative that continues to captivate and horrify because it forces us to look into the abyss of what one man is capable of achieving when he is unburdened by conscience and armed with an unwavering will to power. The physical and psychological toll of Carlos Marcello's prolonged war with the United States government, a conflict that spanned from the Truman administration to the Reagan era, is a largely unexamined but crucial aspect of his story, a slow-burning attrition that gradually eroded the very foundations of the man, transforming him from the confident, ambitious architect of a criminal empire into a weary, paranoid, and ultimately broken figure who outlived his own power. For over 40 years, he existed in a state of perpetual siege, his life a carefully choreographed dance to avoid the ever-present eyes and ears of the FBI, a reality that meant he could never truly relax, never let down his guard, and never enjoy the fruits of his immense wealth and power with the carefree abandon of a legitimate tycoon, his every public movement documented, his every private conversation potentially monitored, his every business transaction scrutinized for a weakness to exploit. This constant pressure created a form of psychological confinement that was in many ways more restrictive than the prison cell he would eventually occupy, a gilded cage of his own making where the walls were made of suspicion and the bars were constructed from the knowledge that a single misstep, a single trusted associate's moment of weakness, could bring the entire towering edifice of his life's work crashing down around him. The weight of this existence was immense, forcing him to live a life of extreme compartmentalization where the loving family man who attended mass and doted on his grandchildren had to be completely walled off from the ruthless crime boss who ordered murders and orchestrated the corruption of an entire region, a schizophrenic division of the self that must have created an unimaginable internal strain, a constant, draining performance for an audience that included both his loved ones and his mortal enemies. We see glimpses of this toll in the historical record, in the rare moments where his legendary composure cracked, such as his furious, venomous rants against the Kennedys captured on FBI wiretaps, outbursts that revealed the seething rage and profound sense of persecution that simmered just beneath his calm exterior, a pressure cooker of emotion that he could only vent in the most private of settings. The relentless legal battles, particularly the decades-long deportation fight, were not just abstract courtroom dramas, they were a grinding, exhausting war of attrition that consumed millions of dollars and countless hours of his time and mental energy, a perpetual cloud of uncertainty that hung over his head and his family's future, a battle for his very right to exist in the country he considered his kingdom. As he aged, the energy required to maintain this dual life and to fend off the increasingly sophisticated attacks of the government inevitably waned, his sharp mind, once capable of managing 1,000 details and anticipating every move of his adversaries, began to slow, its edge dulled by time and the cumulative exhaustion of a life lived on the razor's edge, making him more vulnerable to the kind of technological and legal innovations that would ultimately ensnare him. The diagnosis of dementia in his final years was the cruelest blow of all, a disease that systematically dismantled the very instrument of his greatness, his formidable memory and strategic mind, leaving him trapped in a fading world. A king who could no longer remember the map of his own kingdom, a general who could no longer recall the battles he had won, a man whose past was being erased even before his life had ended. His final incarceration, therefore, was merely the physical manifestation of a confinement that had already existed for years, the final act in a tragedy where the protagonist was ultimately defeated not by a more powerful enemy, but by the inevitable decay of his own body and mind. A solitary end for a man who had always been surrounded by people, yet who had, by the nature of his power and his paranoia, always been profoundly alone. In this light, his story becomes not just a chronicle of criminal enterprise, but a Shakespearean exploration of the cost of power, a reminder that the pursuit of absolute control often demands a price that no amount of money or influence can ever repay, extracting a toll on the human spirit that leaves even the most powerful men isolated, weary, and haunted by the ghosts of their own actions, a poignant and solemn coda to a life of violent and grandiose ambition. The geographical heart of Carlos Marcello's empire, the city of New Orleans and the surrounding parishes of Louisiana, was not merely a passive backdrop for his crimes but an active, willing, and essential accomplice, a unique cultural and political environment that provided the fertile soil in which his particular brand of organized crime could take root, flourish, and become so deeply embedded that it became indistinguishable from the power structure of the region itself. New Orleans, with its long history of official corruption dating back to its colonial days, its celebration of the carnivalesque and the transgressive, and its deeply ingrained system of patronage and political favors, was the perfect ecosystem for a man like Marcello, a place where the line between the legitimate and the illegitimate had always been deliberately blurred, where a well-placed bribe was often considered more effective than a legal petition, and where the population had a long-standing, almost weary acceptance of the fact that those in power were likely on the take. This was not the cynical, industrial corruption of the Northeast, this was a more organic, almost feudal system where loyalty to a local boss or a political faction often trumped abstract notions of civic duty, a world that Marcello understood intuitively because he was born from it, a product of its streets and its particular moral ambiguities. He did not impose his will upon an unwilling populace. He expertly manipulated a system that was already primed for manipulation, leveraging the existing networks of political patronage and adding his own layer of ruthless efficiency and systematic violence to create a hybrid government where the official mayor and the unofficial crime boss were often partners, or at the very least, had reached a stable and mutually understood détente. His power base in Jefferson Parish was particularly strategic, a sprawling suburb that was, during his rise, a rapidly growing frontier of new money and weak institutions, a place where he could influence sheriffs, council members, and zoning boards with relative ease, building a fortress from which he could oversee his operations without the more intense scrutiny of the New Orleans City Police, creating a safe haven that became known as his personal fiefdom. The very geography of the region aided him, with the labyrinthine bayous and swamps providing perfect dumping grounds for the victims of his violence and the complex waterways of the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast facilitating his narcotics and contraband trade, making his territory a natural hub for illicit commerce. He became a shadow mayor, a ghost governor, his influence so pervasive that major business deals, political appointments, and even the outcomes of certain elections could not be finalized without at least considering his reaction, if not seeking his explicit approval, a level of influence that made him a more powerful figure in the daily lives of many Louisianans than the governor in Baton Rouge or the president in Washington. This deep entrenchment meant that for the average citizen, Carlos Marcello was not a distant, mythical gangster figure, but a tangible, if rarely seen, fact of life, a name whispered in connection with a friend of a friend who got a no-show job, a business that suddenly flourished after a mysterious meeting, or a political candidate who unexpectedly dropped out of a race. His presence felt in the unseen currents that shaped the community's destiny. The lasting damage he inflicted upon the region was therefore not just the violence and the drugs, but the normalization of corruption, the installation of a deep-seated cynicism about the very possibility of clean government, a legacy that has proven far more difficult to eradicate than any individual criminal racket, as it poisoned the well of civic trust for generations. To understand Carlos Marcello, one must first understand this symbiotic relationship between the man and his environment, a dance between a uniquely gifted criminal and a uniquely susceptible culture, a partnership that allowed a king to be crowned not in spite of the system, but because of it, creating a dark dynasty that was, in its own terrible way, a perfect reflection of the time and the place that created it, a story that remains etched into the soul of the Gulf South as a permanent warning of what can happen when a society's institutions become so compromised that they can no longer tell the difference between a public servant and a crime boss, between a government and a syndicate. The intricate web of alliances and rivalries that Carlos Marcello maintained with other powerful crime families across the United States forms a critical, hidden chapter in the history of organized crime, a nationwide network of mutual interest and respectful boundaries that allowed his Gulf Coast empire to thrive without significant interference and provided him with a national stature that few outside of law enforcement fully appreciated at the time. His relationship with the powerful Chicago outfit, particularly under Sam Giancana, was one of strategic partnership and mutual profit, where they collaborated on lucrative ventures like the illegal gambling and entertainment circuits that stretched from the Midwest to the South, ensuring smooth operations for touring entertainers and bookmaking operations that crossed state lines. A collaboration built on a foundation of shared Sicilian heritage and a pragmatic understanding that coordinated crime was more profitable than internecine warfare. He maintained a strong and particularly important alliance with the crime family in Dallas, led by Joseph Civello, a connection that provided crucial logistical support for his operations in Texas and would later become a focal point for intense speculation due to the city's tragic role in the Kennedy assassination, creating a southwestern corridor of influence that was entirely under his indirect control. To the east, his reach extended into Florida through his connections with Tampa boss Santo Trafficante Jr., a relationship cemented by their shared interests in Cuban gambling operations before the revolution and later in the narcotics trade that flowed through the Caribbean, making them the undisputed masters of the Gulf of Mexico, controlling every major port from Key West to Brownsville. His standing within the Commission, the national governing body of the American Mafia, was one of unique independence, While he respected its authority in mediating disputes between New York's 5 families, he operated his territory with near total autonomy, his power so consolidated and his control so absolute that he was treated more as a sovereign peer than a subordinate, a testament to the formidable and self-sufficient nature of his New Orleans-based kingdom. These alliances were not based on friendship but on cold, hard business calculations and a shared code of conduct. They allowed for the efficient movement of money, men, and contraband across the country, provided safe havens for each other's operatives when needed, and established clear protocols for resolving territorial disputes without resorting to all-out war, which was bad for business and attracted unwanted federal attention. This national network also served as an intelligence apparatus, with families sharing information about law enforcement movements, potential informants, and new lucrative criminal opportunities, making the American Mafia of the mid-20th century a surprisingly cohesive, if decentralized, criminal conglomerate. Marcello's ability to navigate this complex national landscape, to honor his agreements, and to demand respect from some of the most violent and powerful men in the country, speaks volumes about his reputation for reliability and ruthlessness in equal measure, a man whose word, once given, was considered a binding contract, and whose vengeance, if provoked, was considered inevitable and severe. This web of connections also highlights the true scale of his power, demonstrating that he was not merely a regional boss but a key pillar in a national criminal infrastructure, a man whose influence radiated far beyond the bayous of Louisiana and into the boardrooms of Las Vegas, the nightclubs of Havana, and the political backrooms of Washington, D.C., a reach that made him a far more significant and dangerous figure than his deliberate avoidance of the limelight ever suggested. The eventual downfall of this national network, brought about by the same RICO laws that toppled Marcello, would shatter these decades-old alliances, but during his prime, this interconnected system of criminal power was a formidable force, a shadow nation with its own laws, its own economy, and its own rulers, and Carlos Marcello was, without question, one of its most respected and untouchable kings. The role of Carlos Marcello's immediate family, particularly his brother Joseph, Joe Marcello, serves as a critical and often overlooked pillar in the architectural stability of his criminal empire, providing a layer of trusted, blood-deep loyalty that insulated the boss from the day-to-day operational dangers and allowed the organization to function with a resilience that purely mercenary alliances could never hope to achieve. Joseph was far more than a simple sibling. He was the empire's chief operating officer, the reliable, steady hand who managed the complex logistics of the vast gambling network, oversaw the distribution of funds to corrupt officials, and served as a buffer between Carlos and the lower-level soldiers, a role that required a cool head, meticulous attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to the family name. This fraternal bond, forged in the tough streets of Little Palermo, was the one relationship in the entire organization that was truly immune to the corrupting influence of money or the temptation of betrayal, a connection so fundamental that it allowed Carlos to delegate immense authority without the paralyzing fear of insurrection that plagued so many other crime lords who trusted no one. Joseph's public face was that of a legitimate businessman, co-owner of the town and country motel and other ventures, which provided the perfect cover for his constant proximity to the boss and his intimate involvement in the syndicate's affairs, his presence at meetings and his management of cash flows appearing as nothing more than standard family business practice to the outside world. Beyond Joseph, the entire Marcello family structure was woven into the fabric of the empire, with other relatives and in-laws placed in key positions within the legitimate front businesses, creating a network of nepotism that ensured control remained within the bloodline and that the profits of crime were kept within the family, a classic Sicilian model of clan-based power that had been transplanted successfully to the New World. This reliance on family was both a great strength and a potential vulnerability. While it guaranteed a core of unshakable loyalty, it also meant that when the federal government finally began its major assault using RICO, the entire family structure became a target, with indictments raining down not just on Carlos and Joseph, but on sons, nephews, and cousins, threatening to destroy multiple generations in a single, sweeping legal blow. The pressure on these family members was immense, forcing them to choose between their loyalty to their patriarch and the prospect of spending decades in federal prison, a terrible dilemma that tested the very bonds that had been the foundation of the empire's strength. Throughout the long years of legal battles, the family closed ranks, their public silence a testament to the power of omerta and familial duty, even as their private world was crumbling under the weight of subpoenas, frozen assets, and the relentless media spotlight. In the end, the story of the Marcello family is a microcosm of the larger saga, a tale of immense wealth and power built on a foundation of crime, a story of fierce loyalty and shared sacrifice, but also a tragic narrative of a legacy forever tainted, a name that became synonymous not with business acumen or community pride, but with corruption, violence, and a notorious place in the darkest chapters of American history. The protection and elevation of his family was undoubtedly one of Carlos Marcello's primary motivations, a driving force behind his relentless quest for power and insulation, yet this very quest ultimately ensured that the Marcello name would be remembered not for its strength and unity, but for its spectacular and very public downfall, a poignant reminder that the pursuit of a criminal legacy often inflicts its most lasting wounds not on enemies or society, but on the very loved ones it was meant to elevate and protect. The technological evolution of law enforcement, a slow but relentless march from rudimentary wiretaps to sophisticated electronic surveillance and complex forensic accounting, played the role of a great equalizer in the battle against Carlos Marcello, gradually eroding the advantages that his old-world methods of secrecy and personal loyalty had provided him for so long and ultimately creating an environment where his own words and the testimony of his closest allies became the weapons of his destruction. In the early days of his reign, the FBI's efforts were often clumsy and easily detectable, relying on physical surveillance by large teams of agents in conspicuous cars, a tactic that Marcello could easily spot and evade, using his knowledge of the New Orleans streets and his network of lookouts to simply outmaneuver them, turning their presence into a minor nuisance rather than a genuine threat. The first major technological leap came with the advent of more advanced telephone wiretaps, but Marcello's inherent distrust of phones, a paranoia that proved to be prescient, largely neutralized this tool, forcing him to rely on face-to-face meetings and couriers, a system that, while slower, was far more secure against the electronic ears of the government. This cat-and-mouse game escalated dramatically with the development of miniature, long-term listening devices, the kind used in the BRILAB operation, which represented a quantum leap in surveillance capability, allowing agents to bypass his cautious communication habits and plant a microphone directly in the heart of his command center, his own office, transforming his most secure space into a broadcasting studio that transmitted the inner workings of his empire directly to the FBI. This was not a brief, targeted wiretap. It was a years-long audio invasion that captured the casual, unguarded conversations where the real business of the syndicate was conducted, the offhand remarks, the detailed financial discussions, and the casual orders for violence that formed the pattern of racketeering activity required for a RICO prosecution. Simultaneously, the field of forensic accounting was maturing, giving the IRS and the FBI the tools to follow the complex money trails that Marcello had so carefully obscured, using techniques to pierce the corporate veils of his shell companies, track the movement of funds through his web of front businesses, and demonstrate how illicit cash was being laundered into legitimate assets, attacking his financial infrastructure with a precision that was previously impossible. The legal framework itself became a form of technology with the passage of RICO, a new piece of prosecutorial software that allowed the government to process the vast amounts of data collected from bugs and financial records and output a single, coherent narrative of a continuing criminal enterprise. A tool that could connect a murder in 1960 to a bribe in 1970 to a narcotics shipment in 1980 and present it all as a single, prosecutable crime. The Witness Protection Program, too, was a sociological technology, a system designed to break the ancient code of omerta by offering a scientifically managed escape plan, complete with new identities, relocation, and ongoing support, a program that systematically dismantled the human bonds of fear and loyalty that had been Marcello's primary shield. The convergence of these technologies, the electronic ear, the financial microscope, the legal framework, and the witness safety net, created a perfect storm that his old-world tactics could not withstand, proving that no amount of street cunning or political corruption could ultimately defend against a coordinated, technologically advanced, and patient attack from a modern state. Marcello's story, therefore, marks a pivotal moment in American criminal history, the point at which the analog gangster, no matter how brilliant, was finally outmatched by the digital state, a transition that closed one era and opened another, ensuring that the kind of hands-on, personality-driven criminal empire he built would become a relic of the past. A fascinating but extinct model of power that was ultimately conquered not by a stronger gangster, but by the silent, relentless advancement of technology wielded by a determined government. And so, the epic saga of Carlos Marcello, the little man from the dusty streets of Tunis who forged a criminal kingdom in the swamps of Louisiana and challenged the very foundations of American justice, draws to its inevitable and solemn close, a story that stretches across the vast expanse of the 20th century, touching upon themes of immigrant ambition, ruthless power, systemic corruption, and the haunting, unanswerable questions that lie at the heart of a national tragedy. From his humble beginnings in the immigrant enclave of Little Palermo, where he learned the brutal lessons of survival and the power of fear, to his audacious rise as the unchallenged sovereign of the Gulf Coast's underworld, building an empire of gambling, narcotics, and political influence that functioned as a shadow government with its own laws and its own unwavering sense of order. His life was a masterclass in the acquisition and maintenance of power through a combination of sheer will, strategic brilliance, and a capacity for violence that was both calculated and absolute. For nearly 5 decades, he stood as a colossus of crime, a man who outmaneuvered mayors, governors, and attorneys general, who turned deportation into a temporary inconvenience and who transformed his personal paranoia into an impenetrable fortress of security that defied the best efforts of the FBI until the laws and technologies of the nation evolved specifically to target his unique model of criminal enterprise. His story is irrevocably intertwined with the darkest day in modern American history, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a connection based on motive, means, and opportunity that places him at the center of a conspiracy theory that will likely never be fully proven or disproven, forever linking his name to a wound in the national psyche that has never truly healed. His eventual downfall, orchestrated through the revolutionary RICO statute and the damning evidence of his own words captured on secret recordings, was not a dramatic gunfight but a slow, grinding legal process that culminated in a prison cell and a final, lonely demise in a medical ward, a stark and humbling end for a man who had once commanded life and death with a whisper. The legacy he leaves behind is complex and multifaceted, a blueprint for building a criminal syndicate so deeply embedded in the legitimate world that it becomes almost untouchable, a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of corruption and the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with a determined and resourceful enemy, and a permanent, unsettling question mark over one of the most pivotal events of the modern era. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable duality of the American dream, the dark parallel path where ambition, stripped of morality and fueled by ruthlessness, can achieve heights of power that are both terrifying and, in a perverse way, awe-inspiring. The call to action for us now, as the echoes of his story fade into history, is to remember, to learn, and to remain vigilant, to understand that the battles he represented between law and lawlessness, between public good and private greed, are never fully won, but require each generation to reaffirm its commitment to justice and transparency. The story of Carlos Marcello is not just a tale of a gangster, it is a mirror held up to America itself, reflecting our deepest anxieties about power, our institutions, and the hidden forces that can shape our destiny. We must be the ones who ensure that the shadows in which he thrived are continually pushed back by the light of inquiry and an unwavering demand for accountability. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most powerful and enigmatic crime lords compelling, if you were shocked, informed, and captivated by this journey through his rise and fall, then please, show your support for this channel by liking this video, subscribing for more meticulously researched content into the hidden figures and forgotten chapters of history, and ringing the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the truths that lie just beneath the surface. The search for understanding continues, and your engagement is what makes it possible. Thank you for watching. The role of Carlos Marcello's immediate family, particularly his brother Joseph, Joe Marcello, serves as a critical and often overlooked pillar in the architectural stability of his criminal empire, providing a layer of trusted, blood-deep loyalty that insulated the boss from the day-to-day operational dangers and allowed the organization to function with a resilience that purely mercenary alliances could never hope to achieve. Joseph was far more than a simple sibling. He was the empire's chief operating officer, the reliable, steady hand who managed the complex logistics of the vast gambling network, oversaw the distribution of funds to corrupt officials, and served as a buffer between Carlos and the lower-level soldiers, a role that required a cool head, meticulous attention to detail, and an unwavering commitment to the family name. This fraternal bond, forged in the tough streets of Little Palermo, was the one relationship in the entire organization that was truly immune to the corrupting influence of money or the temptation of betrayal, a connection so fundamental that it allowed Carlos to delegate immense authority without the paralyzing fear of insurrection that plagued so many other crime lords who trusted no one. Joseph's public face was that of a legitimate businessman, co-owner of the town and country motel and other ventures, which provided the perfect cover for his constant proximity to the boss and his intimate involvement in the syndicate's affairs, his presence at meetings and his management of cash flows appearing as nothing more than standard family business practice to the outside world. Beyond Joseph, the entire Marcello family structure was woven into the fabric of the empire, with other relatives and in-laws placed in key positions within the legitimate front businesses, creating a network of nepotism that ensured control remained within the bloodline and that the profits of crime were kept within the family, a classic Sicilian model of clan-based power that had been transplanted successfully to the New World. This reliance on family was both a great strength and a potential vulnerability. While it guaranteed a core of unshakable loyalty, it also meant that when the federal government finally began its major assault using RICO, the entire family structure became a target, with indictments raining down not just on Carlos and Joseph, but on sons, nephews, and cousins, threatening to destroy multiple generations in a single, sweeping legal blow. The pressure on these family members was immense, forcing them to choose between their loyalty to their patriarch and the prospect of spending decades in federal prison, a terrible dilemma that tested the very bonds that had been the foundation of the empire's strength. Throughout the long years of legal battles, the family closed ranks, their public silence a testament to the power of omerta and familial duty, even as their private world was crumbling under the weight of subpoenas, frozen assets, and the relentless media spotlight. In the end, the story of the Marcello family is a microcosm of the larger saga, a tale of immense wealth and power built on a foundation of crime, a story of fierce loyalty and shared sacrifice, but also a tragic narrative of a legacy forever tainted, a name that became synonymous not with business acumen or community pride, but with corruption, violence, and a notorious place in the darkest chapters of American history. The protection and elevation of his family was undoubtedly one of Carlos Marcello's primary motivations, a driving force behind his relentless quest for power and insulation, yet this very quest ultimately ensured that the Marcello name would be remembered not for its strength and unity, but for its spectacular and very public downfall, a poignant reminder that the pursuit of a criminal legacy often inflicts its most lasting wounds not on enemies or society, but on the very loved ones it was meant to elevate and protect. The technological evolution of law enforcement, a slow but relentless march from rudimentary wiretaps to sophisticated electronic surveillance and complex forensic accounting, played the role of a great equalizer in the battle against Carlos Marcello, gradually eroding the advantages that his old-world methods of secrecy and personal loyalty had provided him for so long and ultimately creating an environment where his own words and the testimony of his closest allies became the weapons of his destruction. In the early days of his reign, the FBI's efforts were often clumsy and easily detectable, relying on physical surveillance by large teams of agents in conspicuous cars, a tactic that Marcello could easily spot and evade, using his knowledge of the New Orleans streets and his network of lookouts to simply outmaneuver them, turning their presence into a minor nuisance rather than a genuine threat. The first major technological leap came with the advent of more advanced telephone wiretaps, but Marcello's inherent distrust of phones, a paranoia that proved to be prescient, largely neutralized this tool, forcing him to rely on face-to-face meetings and couriers, a system that, while slower, was far more secure against the electronic ears of the government. This cat-and-mouse game escalated dramatically with the development of miniature, long-term listening devices, the kind used in the BRILAB operation, which represented a quantum leap in surveillance capability, allowing agents to bypass his cautious communication habits and plant a microphone directly in the heart of his command center, his own office, transforming his most secure space into a broadcasting studio that transmitted the inner workings of his empire directly to the FBI. This was not a brief, targeted wiretap, it was a years-long audio invasion that captured the casual, unguarded conversations where the real business of the syndicate was conducted, the offhand remarks, the detailed financial discussions, and the casual orders for violence that formed the pattern of racketeering activity required for a RICO prosecution. Simultaneously, the field of forensic accounting was maturing, giving the IRS and the FBI the tools to follow the complex money trails that Marcello had so carefully obscured, using techniques to pierce the corporate veils of his shell companies, track the movement of funds through his web of front businesses, and demonstrate how illicit cash was being laundered into legitimate assets, attacking his financial infrastructure with a precision that was previously impossible. The legal framework itself became a form of technology with the passage of RICO, a new piece of prosecutorial software that allowed the government to process the vast amounts of data collected from bugs and financial records and output a single, coherent narrative of a continuing criminal enterprise. A tool that could connect a murder in 1960 to a bribe in 1970 to a narcotics shipment in 1980 and present it all as a single, prosecutable crime. The Witness Protection Program, too, was a sociological technology, a system designed to break the ancient code of omerta by offering a scientifically managed escape plan, complete with new identities, relocation, and ongoing support, a program that systematically dismantled the human bonds of fear and loyalty that had been Marcello's primary shield. The convergence of these technologies, the electronic ear, the financial microscope, the legal framework, and the witness safety net, created a perfect storm that his old-world tactics could not withstand, proving that no amount of street cunning or political corruption could ultimately defend against a coordinated, technologically advanced, and patient attack from a modern state. Marcello's story, therefore, marks a pivotal moment in American criminal history, the point at which the analog gangster, no matter how brilliant, was finally outmatched by the digital state, a transition that closed one era and opened another, ensuring that the kind of hands-on, personality-driven criminal empire he built would become a relic of the past, a fascinating but extinct model of power that was ultimately conquered not by a stronger gangster, but by the silent, relentless advancement of technology wielded by a determined government. And so, the epic saga of Carlos Marcello, the little man from the dusty streets of Tunis who forged a criminal kingdom in the swamps of Louisiana and challenged the very foundations of American justice, draws to its inevitable and solemn close, a story that stretches across the vast expanse of the 20th century, touching upon themes of immigrant ambition, ruthless power, systemic corruption, and the haunting, unanswerable questions that lie at the heart of a national tragedy. From his humble beginnings in the immigrant enclave of Little Palermo, where he learned the brutal lessons of survival and the power of fear, to his audacious rise as the unchallenged sovereign of the Gulf Coast's underworld, building an empire of gambling, narcotics, and political influence that functioned as a shadow government with its own laws and its own unwavering sense of order. His life was a masterclass in the acquisition and maintenance of power through a combination of sheer will, strategic brilliance, and a capacity for violence that was both calculated and absolute. For nearly 5 decades, he stood as a colossus of crime, a man who outmaneuvered mayors, governors, and attorneys general, who turned deportation into a temporary inconvenience and who transformed his personal paranoia into an impenetrable fortress of security that defied the best efforts of the FBI until the laws and technologies of the nation evolved specifically to target his unique model of criminal enterprise. His story is irrevocably intertwined with the darkest day in modern American history, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a connection based on motive, means, and opportunity that places him at the center of a conspiracy theory that will likely never be fully proven or disproven, forever linking his name to a wound in the national psyche that has never truly healed. His eventual downfall, orchestrated through the revolutionary RICO statute and the damning evidence of his own words captured on secret recordings, was not a dramatic gunfight but a slow, grinding legal process that culminated in a prison cell and a final, lonely demise in a medical ward, a stark and humbling end for a man who had once commanded life and death with a whisper. The legacy he leaves behind is complex and multifaceted, a blueprint for building a criminal syndicate so deeply embedded in the legitimate world that it becomes almost untouchable, a cautionary tale about the corrosive power of corruption and the fragility of democratic institutions when faced with a determined and resourceful enemy, and a permanent, unsettling question mark over one of the most pivotal events of the modern era. His life forces us to confront the uncomfortable duality of the American dream, the dark parallel path where ambition, stripped of morality and fueled by ruthlessness, can achieve heights of power that are both terrifying and, in a perverse way, awe-inspiring. The call to action for us now, as the echoes of his story fade into history, is to remember, to learn, and to remain vigilant, to understand that the battles he represented between law and lawlessness, between public good and private greed, are never fully won, but require each generation to reaffirm its commitment to justice and transparency. The story of Carlos Marcello is not just a tale of a gangster, it is a mirror held up to America itself, reflecting our deepest anxieties about power, our institutions, and the hidden forces that can shape our destiny. We must be the ones who ensure that the shadows in which he thrived are continually pushed back by the light of inquiry and an unwavering demand for accountability. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most powerful and enigmatic crime lords compelling, if you were shocked, informed, and captivated by this journey through his rise and fall, then please, show your support for this channel by liking this video, subscribing for more meticulously researched content into the hidden figures and forgotten chapters of history, and ringing the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the truths that lie just beneath the surface. The search for understanding continues, and your engagement is what makes it possible. Thank you for watching.